Okay, this week you are taking one of your observation journal close readings and building it into a full essay. What you'll need to do this week is watch this video lesson and pay attention to the 3 strategies for the essay that I described so you can apply it to your essay this week. Then you'll want to read through your observation journal entries and select one that you want to write about. And then you're going to do the peer review session. And you have 2 options for how to do this. You can either participate in a peer review discussion in Foxtail using the peer review discussion tool that I've set up, or you can join us on Zoom at a set time that I'll announce by email, where we'll have breakout groups and where you can discuss together in small groups. Synchronously through Zoom. During this peer review session, you will share what you wrote on your observation journal so far about the painting that you've selected, and your classmates will discuss that with you and look at that painting more closely with you to help you develop more observations about it and discuss or formulate more ideas for what you can write about for your essay. After the peer review session, you'll take the rest of the week to write and submit the essay, and you'll want to pay close attention to the instructions for that essay. They are very similar to your observation journal entry assignment, but it is slightly more elaborate and, of course, more fleshed out, a little bit longer, a little bit more formal. So pay attention to the instructions and apply the 3 strategies that I am going to describe in this video. So let's get started. 3 strategies for doing a successful essay. The first one is that you should back up each of your observations with specific details, direct evidence from the text or the visual work of art that you're describing. And what I mean by backing up each observation with details is that as there's a tendency for writers to under-explain their reasoning process and their observation process. There's a sort of built-in tendency to assume that our readers understand what we're saying more than they actually do. And so when it comes to slightly more formal writing, slightly more analytical writing, it's actually a rule of thumb that you need to slightly over-explain what you're seeing, over-explain what you're thinking to make your evidence build up into observations and make your observations build up into interpretations. Let's think for a minute about what happens when we observe things in visual texts. What are we inferring about the work of art, and what are we actually seeing? For instance, let's look at this painting by Domenichino, The Way to Calvary. And you can see in this painting that there are some very quick, direct observations that anyone looking at it would be able to pick up. For example, Christ, the man in the center, assume we know that is Jesus Christ. Christ is wearing a crown of thorns. The scene looks like it's happening outside during the day. It looks like Christ is carrying the cross on his right shoulder, and Christ is barefooted. These are very simple, direct observations about this painting. Here are some less simple, more indirect inferences I'm making about the painting. The cross looks heavy because Christ is fallen or bent underneath it. The Christ is a criminal or is being treated like a criminal, and I'm basing that on some inferences about the way it appears that there's other criminals in the background of the painting being forced to march along in the same direction as Christ is. Now, if you were restricting yourself just to the knowledge you had about what you're seeing in this painting, then there are some things that you know about this painting if you know what the story of Christ's crucifixion is, that the painting isn't actually telling us. For instance, you couldn't say, just looking at this painting, that the soldiers are Roman soldiers and that Christ was Jewish. Of course, if we know the story, if we know our history, we know that those are facts about these characters. Someone good at history might be able to recognize the soldier's uniform as Roman, but the painting isn't actually saying that to us. So notice the difference between direct and indirect inferences about the visual text. Indirect inductions presuppose and build on simpler inductions or observations, and these indirect inductions are more interesting, actually, about statements about the painting. It's not so interesting that Christ is wearing a crown or barefoot. It's more interesting what that adds up to and what it's saying about who he is and what this event means. Let's take it one step further. What specifically are we seeing when we look at this painting to determine, for instance, something like Christ is being beaten by a soldier? It seems like a pretty direct inference, but it's actually based on something like the following observations and interpretations. A soldier is holding a stick over Christ. The stick is near Christ's back, and the soldier's arm is extended toward Christ with his hand gripping the stick tightly and the palm facing downward, indicating a swinging motion. The soldier looks like a soldier because he is wearing a helmet and other parts of a soldier's uniform. Notice that the inferences I just drew are based on other observations and inferences, which are in turn based on very specific visual details, concrete details in the painting. If you have the painting present in front of you, at some point you could literally point to a concrete detail in it. Christ is being beaten. That's based on the idea that a man is extending a stick in his direction, which is based on the idea that the man's hand is gripping the stick tightly, and you could point directly to that stick being held by that soldier's hand. So what I mean by over-explaining your observations is going most of the way or all the way down from the observation chain down to these specific details, or if you want to think about it the other way, building all the way up from the very specific details in the painting to the observation. Because we have a tendency to under-explain, and because we have to base our observations on very direct evidence in this kind of an essay, you need to do more explaining and more connecting of those things one to another than you might expect. So that's the first strategy. The second strategy is to organize your essay logically. And in particular, going off of last week's lesson about logic and syllogisms, I want you to think about organizing your essay almost to look like a syllogism, where multiple observations are sort of working like premises in a syllogism, and the essay looks like one premise or observation, another premise or observation, and then finally a conclusion, which is like the conclusion in a syllogism. So in this idea, your big observations about the painting are your premises, and your interpretation of the painting is like your logical conclusion. Let's go back to my analysis of Hoji reading the Quran. And if I were to rearrange my analysis of that painting into a logical argument, and if I really wanted to put it into standard form or something like a standard form of a syllogism, I might do something like this. The first main observation I made was that the building is perfectly and beautifully designed to facilitate reading of the Quran that is worshipful and reverent. I made that observation based on lots of details in my analysis of the painting. My second big observation, observation B, the Quran reader, Hoja, is very good at reading in a worshipful and reverent way. I also backed that up with evidence based on the way his clothes look, his facial expression, his posture, and so forth. And so, if I think about those two observations, I might come up with a conclusion like, the building and the readers are working together in this painting to enact the reading of the Quran with reverence and beauty. So that's how I might think about organizing my whole essay. The main observations become the body paragraphs, and I should organize my body paragraphs around those observations. I should probably state the big observations observation A and observation B in this example as like my big topic sentences at the top of my paragraphs. And then I would spend the rest of the paragraphs backing up those observations with evidence, with the details that I've come up with. If the observations are more complex, you can subdivide those into smaller observations, each forming their own paragraph. When it's all said and done, you have an essay that actually imitates the syllogistic form of reasoning, where you have multiple observations that build into a conclusion that is drawn from it. And that leads me to my third and final strategy for the essay. Third, your interpretation or your conclusion must follow logically from your premises. How do you know if your interpretation is following logically from your premises? Well, if we think about the way logical syllogisms work, we know a couple rules. Like, first, the conclusion has to use the same terms or concepts as the premises. If you have a syllogism like this, person A is beautiful and has blue eyes, person B is not beautiful and has brown eyes, the conclusion you would draw from those two premises would have to say something about eyes or beauty, but it couldn't say something about hair. There's nothing about hair in the premises, so obviously a conclusion about hair would be switching the terms from the premises to the conclusion, and that would be what we would call an invalid argument. The logic doesn't make sense, does not follow, the conclusion does not follow from the premises. So your terms must be the same in the conclusion and the premises. The second rule is the conclusion must follow logically from the observations. You can't contradict your observations. So for instance, if you said person A is beautiful and has blue eyes, person B is not beautiful and has brown eyes, you could not therefore conclude that brown eyes are beautiful, because your second premise states that person B has brown eyes and is not beautiful. So there would be a contradiction in that reasoning. Or let's take another example. Person A is beautiful and has blue eyes. Person B is not beautiful and has brown eyes. Therefore, eyes are beautiful. Well, the first premise sort of may be consistent with that, but it's not consistent with the second premise, because we have an example of eyes that are making someone look less beautiful. So that doesn't look like it follows from the premises either. And the final example is the correct way you could do this. Person A is beautiful and has blue eyes. Person B is not beautiful and has brown eyes. Therefore, blue eyes are more beautiful than brown eyes. Now, it's a very small sample size, and if we did further investigation and looked at more blue-eyed and brown-eyed people, we might be able to determine that that's not actually in the real world quite true all the time. But based on these two premises, that's the logical inference that is leading to. The third rule is that the conclusion must draw a conclusion. Your conclusion must make explicit something that was only implicit in the premises. You cannot simply restate or merely combine the premises as your conclusion. So, for instance, person A is beautiful and has blue eyes. Person B is not beautiful and has brown eyes. Therefore, both of these persons have eyes. Just restating two facts in the premises themselves. Another example, person A is beautiful and has blue eyes. Person B is not beautiful and has brown eyes. Therefore, person A is more beautiful than person B. Again, this only combines parts of the premises. This is only adding two things that are already stated explicitly. The right way, again, would be to conclude that blue eyes are more beautiful than brown eyes. This conclusion makes explicit what was implicit in the two premises. It states as a general rule, a thing about eye color, that was alluded to in the premises but not stated by either premise. Okay? So that's what I mean by making sure that your conclusion follows logically from your premises. And one tip I will leave you with is this. This is a bonus tip. As you're planning out your essay and maybe even starting to draft it, try to sketch out in standard form what your main observations are, kind of like what I've done here with the Hoji reading the Quran example. Sketch out what your main observations are, and then look at your interpretation or your conclusion and ask yourself if it looks like it's following logically from those observations. And you are allowed, if you need to take that final paragraph, that final section of your essay, and to spell out some of the critical reasoning that you're using to make that interpretation work. Good luck. I will see you guys either in the Zoom peer review session, or I will be talking to you throughout the week in your peer review discussion groups. And then, of course, I will be looking forward to reading your first essay. Email me questions you might have, and I'm happy to respond. And get started early this week. Don't put off the drafting and writing of the essay until too late in the week. Make sure that you give yourself at least a full day to draft, revise, some time between drafting and revising to make sure it looks good. And definitely double check to make sure you followed the specific details in the assignment. Have a great week.